Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Heather Campion, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, as well as the many sponsors who are all listed in your program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this ceremony at which we bestow the 2014 PEN Hemingway and PEN New England Awards. In a recent essay about the merit and growing plethora of literary prizes, author Amanda Foreman writes, "Last year, the 133-year-old Library Journal announced the creation of a new annual prize, the Amanda Foreman Award for Best Acknowledgements." Laugh all you like, she continues. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. I knew how much effort had been expended in making those acknowledgments as comprehensive and accurate as possible, but I never thought anyone else would notice. Let me pause here to acknowledge and take notice of all those who make this annual award ceremony possible. The Hemingway Foundation and Society, which funds the PEN Hemingway Award, PEN New England, including Helen Atwan, Richard Hoffman, and Karen Wolf, who administer it, the UCross Foundation, the University of Idaho, our distinguished judges for both the PEN Hemingway and PEN New England Awards, and to my colleagues here at the Kennedy Library, especially Amy McDonald, Susan Rinn, and Karen Adler-Abramson. We're honored to have members of the Hemingway family here with us today. Carol and Patrick Hemingway are dear friends and the guiding force for the Hemingway collection. We remain indebted to them for their generosity and the care and direction they offer to support our work. We're also joined by Sean and Colette Hemingway. Sean is Ernest Hemingway's grandson, his wife Colette, and they are the co-chairs of our Hemingway Council, which raises funds and awareness for the collection. And Carol and Patrick's daughter and one of their 4 grandsons, Mina and Rob, are here in our audience. In the novel we honor today, NoViolet Bulawayo paints a scene in which Darling, her delightful teenage narrator, observes her aunt greeting a former lover at a wedding reception celebrating his marriage to another woman. After they exchange greetings, Ms. Bulawayo writes, they stay silent, as if they have no more words. The silent doesn't go away. It's like they're using it to talk. Ernest Hemingway famously used silence in his writing to capture nuance and feelings too intense for words. As John Updike described, it was Hemingway who showed us all how much tension and complexity unalloyed dialogue can convey and how much poetry lurks in the simplest nouns and predicates. The Kennedy Library is proud to be the world repository for Hemingway's papers and materials and to host this annual ceremony in his name to recognize the best books of first fiction published over this past year. Amanda Foreman concludes her engaging essay about how and why we honor authors with these words. Literary prizes are the lighting of the candle that helps society to convene, to share in conversation, and to see beyond itself. A prize may hail a masterpiece or discover a new artist, but its fundamental purpose is to fill the silence with ideas. We're so pleased to convene this gathering and to fill this hall with all of you to celebrate the creativity and power of both aspiring and accomplished writers. I wish to congratulate all of our honorees and make special note that Jennifer Haigh, who is this year's recipient for the PEN New England Award in Fiction, has been recognized twice before at this ceremony, winning the 2006 PEN Winship Award for her novel Baker Towers, and in 2004 she won the PEN Hemingway Award itself for her first novel, Mrs. Kimball. Patrick once commented to me on the perils of an award for first fiction. It's like putting a lot of money down on a horse after she's only won her first race. Jennifer's stellar career, as that of many other PEN Hemingway winners, gives us reason for optimism and appreciation to our judges and their eye for emerging talent. A few years ago, we began a tradition of asking Patrick Hemingway to read an excerpt of his father's work to begin our proceedings. To introduce him, I thought I might share a couple of observations from a forum he participated in a few years ago on this stage. First, he described how he knew, growing up, that his father was a writer, but he didn't realize until he was an adult just how significant an author his father was. As a child, on his father's birthday, he reported, we gave him yellow pads of paper and pencils. The idea was that he would write more so that we all would live better. Second, he suggested that day that anyone interested in his father and his life ignore the biographies and books of criticism and return to the literature itself, especially the short stories, recommending that day, two off the top of his head, Cat in the Rain and Fathers and Sons. In the latter, Nick Adams is out on a drive through the country with his son asleep at his side and begins to reminisce about his childhood, including some of the conversations he had with his dad about sex. I'll spare you those. My son, after all, is in the room. But then there is this lovely remembrance. His father came back to him in the spring when there was jacksnipe on the prairie, or when he saw shocks of corn, or when he saw a lake, or heard wild geese, or in a duck blind, remembering the time an eagle dropped through the whirling snow to strike a canvas-covered decoy, rising, his wings beating, the talons caught in the canvas. His father was with him suddenly in deserted orchards, and in new plowed fields and thickets on small hills, or when going through dead grass, whenever splitting wood or hauling water, by grist mills, cider mills, and dams, and always with open fires. Only Patrick knows what natural phenomena elicit memories of his father for him, but for us, each spring, Patrick returns to Boston to join us for this special ceremony, conjuring the spirit of Ernest Hemingway, which serves as grist for our mill of encouraging new literary talent. At the forum, when Patrick spoke, the moderator was Stan Katz, a dear friend of this library who led the effort to get digital copies made of Hemingway's materials that remained in Cuba so that researchers could have access to them here in the States. Let me conclude my introduction with the words Professor Katz used to close the session that day. All of us who are parents know that the most important thing that could happen to us is to hear someone say that our children were admirable people. And I think we can say that of Patrick and thank him profoundly for being such an admirable man. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Hemingway, our own harbinger of spring, back to the Kennedy Library.
Well, I've got to start thinking of myself as a swallow. The passage I've chosen is from a work of Hemingway that Sean is working on now, a new edition, and has found many fascinating things about. And it's really not much more than a paragraph, but it brings out something I think very true about writers, and see if you agree with me. A month later, POM, Carl, and Carl's wife, who had come out and joined us at Haifa, were sitting in the sun against a stone wall by the Sea of Galilee, eating some lunch and drinking a bottle of wine and watching the grebes out on the lake. The hills made shadows on the water, which was flat calm and rather stagnant looking. There were many grebes making spreading wakes in the water as they swam, and I was counting them and why they were never mentioned in the Bible. I decided that those people were not naturalists. I am not going to walk on it, Carl said, looking out at the dreary lake. It's been done already. You know, POM said, I can't remember it. And what she's referring to is their trip. I can't remember Mr. JP's face, and he's beautiful. I think about him and I can't see him. It's terrible. He isn't the way he looks in a photograph. In a little while, I won't be able to remember him at all. Already, I can't see him. And here comes the punchline. I can remember him, I said. I'll write you a piece sometime and put him in. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm one of the three judges. I'm Scott Turo, and thank you. And along with Ben Sines and Indira Ganesan, I was one of the judges for the PEN Hemingway Awards. And I have to start by saluting my two fellow judges. It's often remarked about intellectual life that the fights are so fierce because there is so little at stake. But we all three of us recognize that that is surely not the case here, both because of the heritage of this prize and the difference it clearly can make in the life of young writers. So we work together with, I think, great respect, looking at, frankly, a body of work as a whole that really astonished the three of us in its quality. American literature, whatever the reports of its demise, is actually in really good shape if the books that we had an opportunity to read this year are any indication. And because of the high quality of what we read, we begged indulgence, and instead of naming the usual two honorable mentions, we named three. One was to Ethan Rutherford for his book of stories, The Peripatetic Coffin. The second was to Jasmine Beach Ferrara for her book of stories, Damn Love. And the last to Christopher Jansma, who is here, for his novel, The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards. And Chris, would you stand and be recognized, please? Now we get on to the finalists and award winners. Mitchell S. Jackson's The Residue Years is as honest and unflinching as it is heartbreaking. Jackson's prose grabs the reader by the throat and slowly makes its way to the reader's heart. The Residue Years is in turn moving, beautiful, urgent, witty, and emotionally raw. Jackson has written an original American tragedy in the tradition of Richard Wright's Native Son. Only a determined and disciplined writer can confront issues of race, class, and addiction without rage and without an ounce of self-pity. To find so much beauty and determination in the face of despair is something of a miracle. Jackson has given us a novel that simply cannot be ignored. Mitchell Jackson, one of the finalists this year for the Hemingway PEN Award for Fiction. Now on to the other finalist, Anthony Wallace. Anthony Wallace's short fiction collection, The Old Priest, slices with the precision of a cardiac surgeon into a unique array of American hearts afflicted by despair. Most of these characters, casino workers, estranged spouses, drifters, meth heads, even writers, have blundered into life's cul-de-sacs, still uncertain about whether they are lost and where else they'd like to go. The title novella is a remarkable jewel that expands not only traditional limits on narrative, but our understanding of terms like betrayal, abuse, faith, and love. Anthony Wallace. And last, on to the winner of this year's Hemingway Foundation PEN Award for Fiction, NoViolet Bulawayo. Darling Nakala, 10 years old, from Paradise, Zimbabwe, dreams of escaping to America and filling her time with her friends, Bastard, God Knows, Stina, and Cheapo, stealing guavas, waiting for the NGO lorry to bring their shantytown supplies, and playing Find Bin Laden. Told in a captivating, urgent voice, NoViolet Bulawayo's first novel is about the life of scraping by and later the life of not losing oneself. America gives Darling new friends and new family, but at what cost? In We Need New Names, we meet a writer whose intelligence, liveliness, and wit promise many more good novels to come. NoViolet Bulawayo.
Thank you all for being here today. Your presence is very much appreciated. I wish to express my gratitude to the Hemingway Foundation, PEN New England, and all the sponsors, the various sponsors, for making this prize and day possible. I would like to thank the judges for considering my work alongside my fellow honorees. It already feels enough to be read and read carefully, but to go on and win this prize on top of it all is such an incredible honor. Thank you. I also wish to thank my editor, Laura Tisdale Brown, my agent, Jean O, who are in attendance, my beloved and supportive sister Zah, my family and friends, and every name that is in and behind We Need New Names. I have said before that it takes a village to produce a book, and I will repeat it again. Thank you for all the support. And finally, I am of two lands, Zimbabwe and the US, and I owe to both a tremendous debt for the nurturing and realization of my writer self. I came to the US to study law, but fortunately or unfortunately, I found myself pursuing writing instead, and so I very much blame the US for the obvious. Winning the PEN Hemingway is not just a great honor, but one that makes me feel like my voice is a part of this space, and I'm very delighted. Thank you. I will now quickly read from my novel, We Need New Names. It's set in a shanty town called Paradise. And the way people end up in this shanty town is that they lose their homes. Their homes are bulldozed by paramilitary policemen. And so they have to find a new place to live. So they come here and build shacks. I am reading a section called How They Appeared that explains these people's presence. They did not come to paradise. Coming would mean that they were choosers, that they first looked at the sun, sat down with crossed legs, picked their teeth, and pondered the decision, that they had the time to gaze at their reflections in long mirrors, perhaps pet their hair, tighten their belts, check the watches on their wrists before looking at the red road and finally announcing, "Now we are ready for this." They did not come. No, they just appeared. They appeared 1 by 1, 2 by 2, 3 by 3. They appeared single file, like ants, in swarms like flies, in angry waves like a wretched sea. They appeared in the early morning, in the afternoon, in the dead of night. They appeared with the dust from their crushed houses clinging to their hair and skin and clothes, making them appear like things from another life. Swollen ankles and blisters under their feet, they appeared fatigued by the long walk. They appeared carrying sticks with which they marked the ground for where a shack would begin and end, and these they carefully passed around, partitioning the new land with hands shaking like they were killing something. Squatting to mark the ground like that, they appeared broken, shards of glass people. They appeared with tin, with cardboard, with plastic, with nails, and other things with which to build. And they tried to appear calm as they put up their shacks, nailing tin on tin, piece by piece, bravely looking up at the sky and trying to tell themselves and one another that even here, in this strange new place, the sky was still the same familiar blue, a sign things would work out for them. Some appeared with children in their arms. There were many who appeared with children held by the hands. The children themselves appeared baffled. They did not understand what was happening to them. And the parents held those children close to their chests and caressed their dusty, unkempt heads with hardened palms, appearing to console them, but really they did not quite know what to say. Gradually, the children gave up and ceased asking questions and just appeared empty, almost, like their childhood had fled and left only the bones of its shadow behind. Generally, the men always tried to appear strong. They walked tall, heads upright, arms steady at the sides, and feet firmly planted like trees, solid Jericho walls of men. But when they went out in the bush to relieve themselves and nobody was looking, they fell apart like crumbling towers and wept with the wretched grief of forgotten concubines. And when they returned to the presence of their women and children and everybody else, they stuck hands deep inside torn pockets until they felt their dry thighs, kicked little stones out of the way, and erected themselves like walls again. But then the women, who knew all the ways of weeping and all there was to know about falling apart, would not be deceived. They rose from the earth, beat dust off their skirts, and planted themselves like rocks in front of their men and children and shacks, and only then did all appear almost tolerable. Thank you.
I am Amy McDonald, and in addition to running the forums at the Kennedy Library, I am also the chair of PEN New England. People often ask what PEN stands for. Poets, playwrights, essayists, novelists. What more fitting institution than the Kennedy Library for PEN to be associated? Not only at the bequest of Jacqueline Kennedy do Ernest Hemingway's papers reside here, but no other administration in our nation's history is more associated with artists, poets, essayists, novelists. Robert Frost, the first poet invited to read at a presidential inauguration, essayists and novelists Lionel Trilling, Pearl Buck, and William Styron, whose wife Rose is a member of our Hemingway Council and is here tonight, all invited to the famous Nobel Prize dinner. The 2014 PEN New England Poetry winner is Karen Skolfield for Frost in the Low Areas. Judge Richard Blanco, the most recent poet to read at a presidential inauguration, writes, "In her magnificent debut collection, Karen Skolfield made me fall in love with poetry all over again, reminding me of its divine power to find the extraordinary and the seemingly ordinary. She understands that poetry does not exist independently. It is pulled out of all of us, out of all we see, without pretense or artifice, and not in the obvious and expected ways either. Her poems surprise with each turn of the line. They foray into the unexpected discoveries and dimensions. After reading her poems, I will never again look at a baby, a fossil, a painting, a key, a homunculus, or myself as I had before. If poetry is meant to challenge and change our perceptions of the world and ourselves, then Karen is by all means an extraordinary poet." Karen? Just like Jennifer Lawrence. Our 2014 PEN New England Fiction winner is Jennifer Haigh for News from Heaven. Judge Aaron Hamburger writes, "This moving and complex linked collection consistently and genuinely surprises the reader, not with the rude shock of the cheap plot twist or the easy and increasingly familiar thrill of postmodern play, but in the classic, richest sense of surprise as practiced by Chekhov. In the 10 stories of News from Heaven, Haigh spotlights the subtlest nuances of human thought and behavior that surprise us in life. All this is achieved in sure-footed, skillful prose that startles with its breathtaking effortlessness and its command of the intricacies of language. News from Heaven is a welcome antidote to our over-caffeinated, over-apt culture. It reminds us of the deeply meditative pleasures, both intellectual and emotional, that are unique to the reading of exemplary fiction." Jennifer. And the 2014 PEN New England Nonfiction winner, Douglas Bauer, for What Happens Next. Judge Dustin Beal Smith writes, "Douglas Bauer's memoir in essays is a riveting meditation on death and dying and an exhilarating and joyful illumination of what it means to have curiosity and spirit. Using closely observed details and avoiding judgment, Bauer lifts the great dome of sky that covers the American heartland and revisits interior spaces that evoke our shared human dread of anonymity, loneliness, monotony, and boredom. By reconstructing the very local lives of his brave Midwestern family, Bauer quietly hints at why many young people abandon the Midwest to pursue busier, more distracted lives on the nation's ecologically fragile coasts. And seen in this light, the question posed by the book's deceptively simple title takes on added gravitas, reading these hauntingly beautiful pages, readers may well find themselves pondering the consequences of American restlessness. Doug?
I want to say that I'm privileged to be standing with Karen and Jennifer as my fellow PEN New England winners and to be in the company of their exceptional books. I've been asked to read a short passage from What Happens Next, and I've chosen one that considers, as the book does more or less explicitly throughout, that stubborn inconvenience of time, that is to say, our time, the time we're allotted, passing quite outside our mortal powers to be in charge of it. And I'll start with a paragraph from the introduction, which explains the book's overall narrative scheme. In my early 60s, and still extraordinarily lucky in my health, I became aware that three key and quite disparate parts of me were showing common signs of wear. It was as if they'd colluded in a devilish partnership to simultaneously launch the beginning mischief of age. First, the cataracts that had long been ripening in both my eyes had reached the stage where they needed to be removed. In addition, I'd been feeling my heart begin now and then to beat too rapidly for no reason I could trace. And finally, my arthritic left knee, a problem for decades, most of its cartilage surgically removed when I was 21, was suddenly much crankier, stiffer, and more painful than it had been. So I scheduled a month of appointments and tests, and for the cataracts, routine surgical procedures. I organized everything into a quick, convenient cluster because I was going to be away from home for some months. But also looking back, I see myself irrationally imagining that if I attended to these matters in a wholesale sweep, it would be as if I were doing away with the evidence that age had found me and settled in to stay. Arranging this calendar, I had no suspicion that the push of narrative, the stuff of story, was in it. So these very ordinary maladies served as my Madeleines of memory and introspection. And so, for example, this brief description of my routine eye surgery. The surgeon's hands as he works inside my eye are making graceful, barely perceptible, coordinated motions. It's as if he were darning with impossible delicacy, as if he were knitting a sweater for a hummingbird. Later, I would learn that as a boy, unwittingly practicing for his future, he loved to construct intricate wooden ships in bottles, none of their countless parts larger than a matchstick. Everything went beautifully, I heard him say to me as I was being wheeled out of the operating room. My more than half a century of severe myopia had been erased in 13 minutes. But brief as the surgery was, strong as was the drug-induced illusion that no time passed, it goes without saying that it did take time. You can hear that sentence saying that it, the surgery, absconded with time in the way that all the events of our days are thieves of a kind, taking our time. Or you can hear it describing something conscientious. The surgery took its time. Aware of the importance of what was being timed, it drew from its own allocation and used it responsibly. or that it took its own sweet time, as though surgery's time were more desirable than mine. And on you could go in the course of this magical transformation of my eyesight. Time had been reversed, and time had been suspended, and time had emphasized how mercilessly it proceeds. In the course of my informal research, I was particularly fascinated to learn of a doctor in Boston who works obsessively to lower the time he takes to perform this surgery. He studies tapes of himself operating, looking for God knows what that might trim a few seconds. He stands a long measuring stick next to every supine patient to make sure the bed is adjusted to a never-varying distance from the patient's nose to the operating room floor. He directs the nurses and assistants to position themselves for each surgery in the same exactly designated spots. He has reportedly gotten his time down to 4 or 5 minutes and performs as many as 40 cataract surgeries a day. The doctor who described this fanaticism to me argued that his colleague's motive was not greed, just a need to compete against himself that had gotten, I would say, way out of hand. I was told that the man is a fine surgeon and that his scores of patients are perfectly safe in his care. All the same, I was glad I'd been in the care of mine, for whom 13 minutes is quite fast enough, and where everything goes beautifully, in tune with time, as it waits and repeats, as it pauses and proceeds. Perhaps I was particularly fascinated by the story of the surgeon's relentless efforts to lower his time because it reminded me of the games I played as a boy on our farm. I was 8 years old when my brother, my only sibling, was born. So to populate my childhood and entertain myself and imagine that I was gloriously the hawk-eyed athlete I was not, I fantasized bizarre sporting events played in crowded stadiums. Any activity could become a game. Any patch of grass, any front porch, any garage or machine shed, a packed arena. Our dark, low-ceilinged chicken coop, for instance, where my hated chore of gathering the eggs became every afternoon a vast stadium, hosting a daily televised World Cup. How many eggs could I collect? How quickly? Could I better the world record time I'd set the day before? I hurried with my bucket along the rows of cubby holes, reaching in for the eggs, grabbing the nesting hens I was terrified of by the neck, and as they fiercely pecked my hand, flinging them to the floor, my goggles thick eyeglasses fogging up with dust and sweat, while my voice, in the person of the play-by-play announcer, breathlessly described my masterful neck grip, my matchless technique, the likes of which would not be seen again in professional egg gathering anytime soon. My solitary days were filled with such events. The United States Gravel Road Bicycle Time Trials, the Greater Midwest Cornrow Sprint Championships. And could the cataract surgeon, with his tapes and measuring stick and exactly positioned assistants, be imagining his world all that differently as he pursues his skewed notion of personal best? I picture my surgeon as a boy happily lost in the exacting privacy of his model shipbuilding. He and his manual dexterity and his preternatural patience matched against the challenging dimensions of very tiny pieces and very tiny spaces. I, on the other hand, was lost in quite another way of play, imagining myself every day stunningly triumphant before an audience of thousands, emerging blinking and victorious from the dark of the chicken coop, or staggering out into the sunlight from high corn rows, the other contestants still back there somewhere in the field, or leaving the rest of the cyclists in my gravel dust, winning contest after contest against time, which takes its defeats with patience and grace as it waits for the day it will start to win. And once it does, never lose again. Thank you.
It is an honor and a privilege this afternoon to introduce Geraldine Brooks. Australian by birth, from a family that included a father who was a big band singer and a mother in the radio, she started at the Sydney Morning News as a reporter, and later at the Wall Street Journal, covering war zones in Bosnia, the Middle East, Africa, places that would provide settings for her later books. The stories she tells in her novels are nothing short of spectacular, combining a keen penchant for research with a novelist's exploration of what makes a character act the way she does given the circumstances. Geraldine Brooks produces work that is unflinching in portraying the horror and splendor of humanity, as well as the small acts of the ordinary that connects us as a species. Her spellbinding first novel, The Year of Wonders, is based on a village in England that quarantined itself from the country when plague was discovered within its boundaries in order to contain the disease. March, about Louisa May Alcott's character of the absent father in Little Women, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 2006 and is about an abolitionist and vegetarian ministering in Union camps populated by racists. Caleb's Crossing, featuring Harvard's long-ago mission in 1650 to provide an education for both English and Indian youth in the country, and centers on the first Native American graduate of that college in 1665. In her books, we see the singular voice in which the thing not expected takes the road not traveled and offers the complexity of what it means to be human. In an interview about March, asked about writing in a gender not her own, our keynote speaker said, "The human heart is the human heart, no matter what century we live in, what country we inhabit, or what gender we happen to be." Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Geraldine Brooks. Yes, that's all very well, but it's not an experiment I'm going to rush to repeat. I much prefer to hear female voices in my imagination. I found that comes a lot more naturally to me. They told me I may speak about anything today, so I thought I would speak about inspiration because Ernest Hemingway was such a great inspiration to me in my writing life, both as a journalist and as a novelist. In fact, an anthology of his work on writing was the closest I had to a graduate education in the art. He spoke about inspiration very insightfully. When somebody asked him where you get an idea for a novel, he replied that an idea for a novel can be something that you're lucky enough to overhear, or the wreck of your whole damn life. Well, luckily for me, so far, it has been the former rather than the latter. I've been inspired variously by a finger post pointing to a small English village that underneath had the notation Plague Village. I've been inspired by a rumor overheard in a wartime Sarajevo bar, and I always thought Hemingway would like that. And a notation on a map of Martha's Vineyard about Wampanoag place names. I think Hemingway would also have approved that I learned how to recognize whether or not an idea was a good idea for a novel by watching a home movie about sports fishing. This home movie was being shown on Oprah Winfrey's show one day, and I was waiting in my doctor's office where the flat screen TV was tuned to Oprah. And on it, a young woman was retelling how she had been out videotaping her boyfriend one sunny day off the coast of New England, and he had hooked a magnificent swordfish. And she's filming as the fish is breaching in the sunlight, a ball of muscle struggling for its very existence, and she is oohing and ahhing at the prowess of her manly boyfriend in this battle. And then all of a sudden, the script changes because the fish turns in midair and is suddenly coming straight towards the camera lens, and her screams of delight turn to a yell of horror, and the fish spears her through the chest. But she didn't die. Why? Because the gooey contents of her silicone breast implant broke the momentum of the sword and diverted it away from her vital organs. So there she is on Oprah's couch, holding up her chest x-ray. And there I am in the doctor's waiting room with my chin on my chest, going, "You could not make that up." And that should be a tragic admission for a novelist. But I realized in that moment that that's exactly what I look for in the ideas, the inspirations for my novels, is a story that's too good to be true. Mark Twain memorably said that fiction must be plausible, truth needn't be. So I am a searcher after the implausible truths that a Latin-speaking Wampanoag raised in his own language and culture sat down at Harvard with the sons of the Puritan colonial elite and graduated in 1665. That a village actually chose quarantine rather than fleeing the bubonic plague, that a Jewish book, the Sarajevo Haggadah, was saved time after time by Muslim hands. So these are the implausible truths that create the inspiration for my fiction. I don't think that Hemingway would approve of another key source of inspiration that I received in a math lecture. I don't think Papa had too much time for math lectures. And neither do I, to be quite honest, but I was lucky enough to have a fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study a few years ago. And that's an interdisciplinary fellowship. And your only obligation is to go there and do your own work in the company of people from diverse fields of intellectual endeavor and the arts, and you each give a presentation on what you have been working on during the year. And you're supposed to go to each other's. That's the polite thing to do. So I attended a lecture entitled Singularities in Algebraic Plane Curves. I slumped into the room, armed with a doodle pad. My plan was to sit politely and let the talk sail over my head. I would use the hour for meditative reverie. Perhaps if I positioned myself wisely, I thought, a little nap might even be possible. But on the pad I carried that day, I have a few fragments of the sentences the mathematician used. And I'm going to read a couple to you. A formal power series about the origin is an infinite sum. Homomorphism is an isomorphism if and only if the matrix is invertible. This is like poetry, I thought, and I leaned forward to hear more. The mathematician was eloquent. She was passionate. And when I set aside my firm belief that I could not comprehend her, something strange happened. It wasn't that I understood her work, but I understood her vision. I realized that I'd lived until that moment in an airlock, and she was prizing open the heavy door, just a crack. And in the sudden brief shaft of light,
I glimpsed a sliver of the world beyond, the world in which she lived. When she looked at the old maple beyond the lecture room window, at the great swoop of bough arcing out from massive trunk, her consciousness overlaid a pattern on that branch that was elegant and sensual. I could imagine for a moment what it was to see with her eyes, to feel with her heart, to inhabit a space in which the language was not particular and national, but infinite and universal. A world in which every object sang to her with its own particular music. I know now that that is a beautiful world, but I also know that I can't live there, because if she has lungs, I have gills. I swim in a sea of words. I need them for my life and for my work. But I am sure, though, that our work, the mathematicians and mine, is essentially the same. In her exploration of the singularity in every plane curve, she seeks a way to more perfectly describe that arcing branch, or a soaring bridge, or the quivering S-bend in a squirrel's upraised tail. She pushes her way deeper and deeper into the full truth of the world. And this, I understand, is what a novelist must also do. It's my great good luck that the words I use are English words, which means I live in a very old nation of open borders, a rich, deep, multi-layered, promiscuous universe, infused with Latin, German, French, Greek, Arabic, and countless other tongues. I wouldn't be able to swim so far or dive so deep in a linguistically isolated language such as Hungarian, or even a protectively elitist one such as French. But when I write a word in English, a simple one, say, chief, I've unwittingly ushered a querulous horde into the room. The Roman legionary is there, shaking his cap or head. The toque-wearing cook is there too, reminding me that English had chef from the French before it had captain from the Latin, which is why the word chief now sounds more like the younger word than the elder. I don't care if the English root of chief is properly described as French or Latin. I don't care what a linguistics expert would say. But as a novelist, I'm glad to have this immense cast of captains and chefs standing behind my chief, telling me that whoever she is in my novel, she trails a vast raft of history and association behind her, subtly framing her in my readers' minds before I have let her utter a single word. I didn't start out to be a novelist. I wanted to be a reporter, newspaper reporter in the city of my birth. I formed that ambition when I was 8 years old, and I went to visit my father at his workplace. He was then working as a proofreader on the Sydney newspaper, and we arrived just as the presses were about to roll for the evening edition of the paper. Proofreader, evening edition. Wonderful things. It's a pity we don't have either of them anymore. But he took me down to the press floor, and the air was thick with a mist of ink, and the gigantic rolls of newsprint were waiting, ready. The foreman hit the big red button, and the presses started to roll, and newsprint sailed across the room, and there was a blur and a thunder of noise and a shaking of the floor that you could feel vibrating through your body. And then the papers started landing on the conveyor, and my dad reached out a hand and grabbed one and handed it to me, and it was warm. It was hot off the presses. And I looked down and read the big black screaming headline about corrupt Sydney politicians, and I thought, holy cow, I'm the first person in the city who has a clue what's going on here today. And from that moment, that was the career I wanted to pursue. In my 20s, unexpected doors opened to me. I came here to graduate school at Columbia University, and the Wall Street Journal actually hired me and sent me off around the world as a foreign correspondent. And here again, Hemingway was a great inspiration. Hemingway always said that you can't write writing, you have to live a life. He wrote that war is the only subject there is. Anyone who says otherwise, he wrote, only does so because they haven't had the opportunity to experience it. I didn't set out to be a war correspondent. I was thinking more like restaurant critic or film reviewer. But way leads on to way, and through a strange series of events, I found myself as a person whose packing list included both a chador and a bulletproof vest. And I went out there and spent about a decade covering modern catastrophes. A foreign correspondent, as Hemingway has movingly written, enters people's lives at the worst of times and mines them for its most terrible details. You write the story, hoping that somebody who matters will read it and give a damn, and then you try to forget about it so that you can go on, another country, another visa, and do it all again, another war, some other person's desperate sadness. You try to forget. You try to clear the cache, but you can't. You can't drag and drop your memories into the void. What is the price of experience, asked the poet William Blake. Do men buy it for a song or wisdom for a dance in the street? No, it is bought with the price of all that a man hath, his house, his wife, his children. Wisdom is sold in the desolate market where none come to buy, and in the withered field where the farmer plows for bread in vain. So now, as a novelist, I try to use the experiences that I have had to make the suffering I witnessed count for something. I believe fiction matters. I know it has power. I know this because the jailers and the despots are always so desperately afraid of it. In Israel, I interviewed and later befriended a 15-year-old Palestinian after he stoned my car on the road to Hebron. Not long after, his militancy landed him a 5-year sentence in an Israeli jail. Because in the afternoon that we'd spent together, he'd told me he loved English books. I brought to the jail a copy of The Old Man and the Sea. I thought that story of the nobility of struggle, even without success, might be accessible and moving to him. I guess the jailers thought so too, because they wouldn't allow him to have that book. I thought of that boy more recently when Major Michael Murray, who was a U.S. Marine attorney assigned to the defense of one of the Guantanamo prisoners, recounted how he'd been barred from giving his client a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. He also noted that the few letters his client was allowed to receive from his family, in every single case, the word love was always redacted. These stories enrage me, but they also get me up in the morning. I'm glad that jailers fear the power of fiction and the power of words. It encourages me to try harder, to give them something new to worry about. I was wondering if it would be okay at a Hemingway event to quote from my real role model as a foreign correspondent, Martha Gellhorn. I was encouraged when over lunch I had a chance to talk to Patrick Hemingway, and he described Martha Gellhorn as, in many ways, his favorite stepmother. So I will quote Martha, a speech she gave in 1987 towards the end of her life, the end of her very long and distinguished career, covering war from the civilian point of view. And she said, she described her career as having been like throwing very small pebbles into a very large pond. And she said that she had no idea if any pebble had caused the slightest ripple. But she said that was not her responsibility. Her responsibility was the effort. I belong, she said, to a global fellowship, men and women, concerned in the welfare of the planet and its least protected inhabitants. Well, the planet's welfare has never been in more jeopardy, and its least protected inhabitants never in more need. So I want to thank the generous donors to the PEN Hemingway Award for keeping words of power alive, encouraging a new generation of writers, and let's hope that we can give the despots plenty to worry about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Geraldine Brooks, for those inspiring words about implausible truths. You may just have tipped the balance for some in this audience who were previously on the fence about dedicating their lives to writing or considering getting silicone breast implants. Ted Sorensen once wrote about John F. Kennedy that he was torn between a desire to enjoy the world and a desire to improve it. In Death in the Afternoon, Hemingway writes, "Let those who want to save the world. The great thing is to last and to get your work done." So before we all return to our work or efforts to improve the world around us, I hope you'll all join for a moment to enjoy this beautiful view and delightful afternoon at a reception in our pavilion with food, spirits, and conversation. Our award winners will be available to sign books, which are on sale in our bookstore. I began by mentioning the Amanda Foreman Award for Best Acknowledgements, and so perhaps it is fitting to close with final words of appreciation from NoViolet Bulawayo's acknowledgments in We Need New Names. Quote, "For the gift of stories, she thanks her homeland of Zimbabwe, for the soul and for the swag." Cue music. Thank you all for coming.